the statistics are quite frightening. About 5 trillion, that's with a T, losses in the stock markets around the world in the last couple of months. 1 billion people unemployed in this world, and half of the world as we know it in some kind of a recession. That means trouble for everybody. You can't just pretend that we've got walls at our borders. We're having a discussion about the financial crisis with Bill Emmett, the editor-in-chief of The Economist magazine. Talking a little bit about the response of the world to these situations and the fear for trade, that if we look around and say, you know, oh gee, that's a trouble spot, maybe we won't buy from those guys, maybe we won't sell to those guys. Do you think we're headed back into a period of protectionism again?
I hope not. So far, since the crisis began, actually, there's been very little rolling back. If you'd asked me beforehand, will there be rolling back in these kind of circumstances, I'd have said there would be some. Really, there's only been Malaysia putting on capital controls, small country, slightly strange place. Everywhere else, there's been nothing. Just see the beginnings in the US with their lawsuits against steel imports and some other sectors coming up. And it's really in the US and Western Europe that worries me most, because I think the rest of the world, the emerging markets, feel that they do depend on the openness of the rich countries. They don't have a choice.
They have to trade.
We have the choice.
It brings us to the question of the IMF, and we witnessed the meeting a couple of weeks ago, and someone who was there, Sylvia Austri, who was down there, was talking with a friend, standing outside these meetings and sort of saying, here we are, having this discussion about architecture when the building is burning. And it seemed to be a nice description, not a pleasant one, but, you know, an accurate description of what's going on. We're talking about, you know, how this big machine can move and can it respond fast enough. And we're seeing the world financial system in a state of collapse. Do we have time to reinvent this system?
No, no. All this talk about rebuilding the architecture, redesigning the system and so forth is almost certainly just a cover for a sort of fear that nobody knows what to do, but they've got to sound like they're doing something. But B, insofar as it means anything, which I doubt, it means something for 10 years' time.
So what do we do in the short term when it appears it's very difficult for these organizations to move? Now, the money did go to Brazil. We're not sure how that's going to work out. You know, there have been some responses, but it doesn't seem to be flexible enough.
I think it's not quite flexible enough. I think that's right. And this is partly because we, as Western nations, aren't willing to empower the IMF and the World Bank to do things flexibly enough. We won't transfer our sovereignty to them. We give them a limited amount of money. We use them as a sort of lightning rod for criticism so that we're not criticized, they are. But we don't actually empower them to really get stuck in these countries early enough.
Your view of that? I mean, that is the whole fundamental issue here as we head into the globalized period. You know, obviously there has to be some forfeiting of sovereignty, but how far? What is the global governing structure?
Well, I think that it's clear that it will come in bank supervision, because that's where there's an obvious panic factor about hedge funds losing money here and banks losing money there. And there's no real sort of political opposition to that. But where it won't come is in interference in people's macroeconomic policy and their basic operations. I don't believe that the United States, France, Germany even, will actually favor giving sovereignty to a sort of world government body. Canada might. I don't think Britain would. You know, you can imagine there would be some countries that would favor this, but not very many.
But what about some kind of controls? I mean, there's sort of the, you know, the Tobin tax that's always been out there as an idea. You just put a charge on every one of these moves that the guys in suspenders make, and maybe it'll change their view a little bit. Others saying if you start to do that and try and put the rules in place, you'll have a real credit crunch because the investors will simply stay home.
Well, there's no doubt that it's a long-term thing. I mean, once you've got the capital disappearing through the sluice gates, there's no point in suddenly deciding that you should be stopping it coming in the first place. Your problem is that it's going out. So if you put taxes on, put controls on, it's not going to come back in. That's true. It's a long-term solution, this sort of control. I think that countries will, as a result of this crisis, adopt certain controls on short-term flows, A lot of countries were too enthusiastic about getting hot money coming in without then reforming their own financial institutions, their own supervision, their own structures to make it capable of dealing with the stuff.
But what do we do at this end? I mean, those are sort of the countries on the receiving end, but do we not have any responsibility to say to the people who live in our economies, in our societies, you can't go play with fire like that and then expect, you know, the Federal Reserve to bail you out, or the IMF to bail you out, or the government to bail you out when you make a bad investment?
No, I think we do have that responsibility towards our own banks and our own financial institutions to enforce proper supervision. We also have a big responsibility through the accounting companies, I think, the big 5 accounting firms that put their names on all sorts of dubious accounts locally and internationally that in effect give a rubber stamp to all sorts of strange investments. They're basically colluding in a lot of speculative activity. They should take a lot of responsibility.
Just one final question on the IMF, I guess, if I could. Some people look back to 95, to the bailout, the peso crisis in Mexico, and cite that example of sort of the message that the IMF and the World Bank sent to these high gamblers, these high rollers, which is go in, make a lousy investment, don't worry, we'll come in and save you. Does that have to change at that level?
I think that's unfair. About that crisis. I think it was right to go in and help Mexico out. I think that when you have a bailout, when you have a rescue, you need to make the lenders share the pain. What's necessary now in a lot of these Asian countries is a debt restructuring, more or less like a Chapter 11 type workout. Right,
declare bankruptcy and reinvent the game,
And in that, the lenders have to take the losses. And it is wrong and dangerous to stop them taking losses. I'm absolutely sure about that.
All right, we will continue our discussion with Bill Emmett, editor-in-chief of The Economist, turn our attention to some of those other economies, including Japan, that he's written an awful lot about, and get an update on the state of European politics. A lot of governments moving to the left. Is the worst over? Is the worst yet to come? When we take a look at the international financial situation, our guest, Bill Emmett, editor-in-chief of The Economist magazine, do you think, and I don't know how you want to break this down, the likelihood of recession, depression, how do you judge those?
I don't think depression looks likely. I think that word is overused and somewhat hysterical. Recession is clearly likely, I think, in North America and Western Europe. We cannot be immune from what's happened in Asia and the other emerging markets, but also we have problems in our own economies.
Why do you think the United States is so vulnerable at this point?
I think because it, too, rather like China and some of the other countries, had excessive growth in the 1990s, particularly on consumer spending. You know, Americans now save 0.5% of their incomes.
We just spend it all.
And that's gone down and down and down, so it means people have been spending more than their incomes, really. And that's going to turn. You see it with the consumer confidence figures this week. People are getting more worried about the situation. I think they will draw in their spending a little bit, and that can have a big effect.
The stock market has just been one of those places where, people have spent wildly because there's just been this extraordinary run of the bull market, and so it's the only experience that many people have, and they think that is going to be their retirement. A lot of the stocks totally overvalued and overpriced. Is there going to have to be yet another big correction, which is the word they use there? Are we headed for a real
I have to say I believe we are, just because, as you say, the valuations are so outlandish really now. The argument in favor is that of the current levels is that the expectation is for a 1-year slowdown followed by a resumption of rapid earnings growth. I think that's too optimistic. One can imagine a 2-year slowdown or a sharp recession. And then who knows what happens after that, because it's all in the hands of politics and policy. So I think it's now just too much follow the yellow brick road sort of investing.
All right, let's see, because you have this international perspective, I mean, let's get your view on a couple of countries, including our own. The finance minister saying, the fundamentals are right, and the prime minister on another day of the week saying, gee, we better be careful. We got the head of the World Bank saying the worst crisis he's ever seen. Where are we? Where does Canada fit in this little scene?
Well, Canada's clearly vulnerable because of the way commodity prices have fallen so much, and that really hurt your dollar. I don't think that Canada has fundamental problems.
We're just going to be sideswiped everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think the hurricane comes through from time to time, but I don't feel that there's a fundamental imbalance or structural problem in Canada.
So we sit and wait it out and hope the Americans don't go into a full-fledged recession, because we'll feel the waves.
Yes, you will feel the waves. I think you're in a lot better shape than you were 5, 10, 15 years ago to deal with that kind of thing. You're a lot more resilient.
Is the concern over, or at least the tempered concern about the Brazils of the world? Do you think we're going to resolve that problem?
What do you mean by the Brazils of the world?
Well, that seemed to be where the the contagion jumped, and everyone says if it goes from Asia to South America to Latin America, then we're really in trouble. The money is going in there. It's not clear exactly what's going to happen.
I think Brazil will be all right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about Brazil. I think that they've just re-elected a stability-minded president.
Yeah.
There's a resilience to accept a bad 1999, but to restructure while they go through a bad year. I don't think that the whole thing is going to go into collapse, and I think the same is true of Argentina.
Yeah.
So I think Latin America is a relatively good picture. It's China that really worries me.
Before we get there, I want to stop two places. One is Russia, one is Japan. If we talk about stability in South America, we sure don't have it in Russia.
Russia, the only sophisticated analysis is
exactly. That's all you can say.
That's all. I mean, frankly, they don't have a president.
Yes.
They have a prime minister who still hasn't produced a plan, even though he's been in office for 5 or 6 weeks now. The place is just in slow collapse, really.
I guess, it sounds so cruel to say, but because your economy is not that big, it doesn't really matter to us?
I don't think it matters that much. It caused a lot of shock at the beginning of August when they declared a kind of default.
Right.
But that was not because it was Russia, it was because it suddenly said to investors, good God, governments might default. Maybe we've made mistakes elsewhere in the world. But Russia itself, apart from the fact that it has nuclear weapons, which is kind of an awkward detail, isn't that important.
Yeah. All right, Japan, an area that you're very well versed on, having written about this and lived there, Japanophobia. Are they getting their act together?
No. In a word.
You're just a bundle of good news, aren't you?
I actually am a little more optimistic than that makes it sound about Japan. I think that they've been amazingly disappointing. They're in their 8th year of financial trouble and still haven't really sorted it out.
What's the problem?
The problem is politics and the way in which interest groups, particularly the banks, have got a grip of politics. It's cronyism, really. And the banks are struggling to avoid taking the hit that is necessary in order to then recapitalize. But I think in 3 or 6 months' time, as things get worse, frankly, then the politicians will say, look, enough already. We are going to nationalize all these banks. We're going to recapitalize. And then I think Japan will start to recover.
All right. When we come back, we'll pick up on the China issue, a few more points there, and then we want to take a look at politics in Europe. Stay with us. Bill Emmett is our guest. Bill Emmett, the editor-in-chief of The Economist, and we're doing our international quiz and tour here of the state of the world financial scene. You have put in the course of this conversation, and certainly in the magazine, this week's edition, Will China Be Next?, a huge emphasis on that, and you've touched on it already. But do you really fear when you say those things that, there may be economic problems, there may be, political turmoil, you've actually kind of used the word civil strife at this point. What does that mean for the rest of us?
Well, I think that a domestic problem in China doesn't mean very much, but the big question is whether that then changes the tenor of the government there.
Yeah.
For the last, God knows how many years, the credibility, the legitimacy of the communist government in China has been tied to economic growth. If economic growth disappears, you have rising unemployment, social unrest. There's only one next resort they can go for, and that's nationalism.
Right.
And what I fear is an aggressive nationalism, which says, look, we've got to keep this country together in this difficult economic climate, this climate that's been caused by all those terrible outsiders who have done this to us. We must reclaim our territory. We must take Taiwan.
Yeah.
Or we must establish a protective zone.
Life in Hong Kong might be a bit different,
exactly,
too.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I worry about.
Yeah. How crucial do you think that would be? I mean, we were in Hong Kong last year taking a look at sort of the, 6 months into the handover. A lot of uncertainty at that point about whether the two systems would be able to reconcile. Do you think that's true, short of an economic crisis inside China?
Well, the surprise in the last year since the handover has been how well Hong Kong has run politically. It's been given a lot of autonomy. Even as its economy has gone downhill. It's in economic trouble, but political calm. I think that's unlikely to stay if there's political turmoil in China itself. I think that for the moment, the Chinese leaders can afford to let Hong Kong be autonomous, run its own things. But if you got real instability there in mainland China, then
there'd be another reaction.
I don't think they would tolerate dissent in the press, dissent from the politicians in Hong Kong who would then want to try to tell China what it should be doing.
Politically, would that give us another Cold War?
I don't think quite that, but you would be moving into uncharted territory, so it'd be hard to tell. I think you may well then start to see some other countries in Asia rethinking their relationships. America is incredibly intertwined with Asia, with very forward deployment of troops. In a situation in which they really thought that they had a different China to deal with, some countries might decide that perhaps they needed to shift their allegiance and to say, well, we've got to get these Americans out, for example. I think you'd get a new fracturing of the alliances. Japan, I think, would be particularly vulnerable
at that point.
At that point. They really rely on the alliance with the U.S., but they're afraid of China.
Before we turn to the Canadian situation, which we will in a moment with two of our country's leading economists, I want your take on what's going on, politically speaking, in Europe. I mean, governments, not only in Britain, but in Germany, a new chancellor sworn in this week, in France, in Italy, a huge move to the left. Is that even a fair description?
I think it's an exaggeration.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that what Tony Blair is, but he certainly isn't left-wing. He may be a modified Thatcherite, actually.
Those are words used in your magazine and by others, that in fact that's what's happened. I mean, he's head of the Labour Party, but you could never tell.
A lot of people in the Labour Party don't think he's a Labour member. Now, Gerhard Schröder is a harder man to read even than Tony Blair, partly because he hasn't even said yet what he wants to do. He's a sort of empty vessel waiting to be filled. He does have people in his government who are quite left-wing, and that might be a leftward switch in Germany, which would make a difference mainly to the sort of welfare state issue in Europe and sort of social reform, labor market reform.
But they're coming in, particularly in the German situation, a very tough time. I mean, unemployment is actually a problem in that country, which it isn't generally over time. A huge debate about the cost of the welfare programs.
Yeah, they're going to have a big dilemma, particularly if the economy turns down. I think they would have hoped they'd have come into power and had a few good years in the economy to then see unemployment falling and maybe work out what they wanted to do. Actually, growth next year is going to slow down. Maybe unemployment will start to rise again.
Is this a response in some way to, I don't know, the bigger picture, sort of the more conservative governments over the last decade? Does it have something to do with the European economy or community and people's need to find some more autonomy? Why is this all happening at this point?
I actually think coincidence is the best explanation. In Germany and Britain, you had governments that had been there for 18 years in one case, 17 in the other, something like that. At such a point, you always switch to the opposition, and it just happens they were left-wing-ish oppositions. In France and Italy, I guess the common factor there might be the controversy over the single currency and the desire or need with the single currency to be fiscally austere, to meet the requirements of the Maastricht Treaty, that you had to cut your fiscal deficit. That was obviously socially painful.
Right.
And maybe a left-wing government in both cases was in a better position to sell the pain.
So people have just said, those guys were too tough about it. We want somebody more sympathetic to do the cutting.
That was clear in France,
Yeah.
where the right-wing Prime Minister, Alain Juppé, essentially he didn't get anything wrong, he just sold it badly.
Yeah.
Because Lionel Jospin has not changed things markedly since then.
Tell us about the European community. I mean, it seems to be moving forward, the debate over the euro. What does this mean in terms of international relations?
Well, we'll have the euro in January next year. We won't have a coherent European community, however. So I don't think we have a real counterbalance to the US in international financial affairs yet. What will matter is how we get through this sort of crisis period. This might bind Europe together and force greater coordination, maybe hand leadership to Schröder, who then will be a real counterbalance to the US. But I'm skeptical about that. I think that they're basically a lot of nation states. It was once said that the European community was a bunch of married couples meeting in a Brussels hotel for a sort of group orgy once in a while, and then going away again.
And doing their own thing.
And doing their own thing.
Well, I mean, that is the sense from afar, and one wonders what the point is at a certain time about this currency and about this arrangement.
Well, I think it will increase trade, it will boost the economy, but it's not producing political integration, that's the thing. And that's what makes it have a limited effect on international relations. Yeah. In terms of the internal operations of Europe, it'll have a big effect, and is having a big effect. We are having a single market.
All right, the view from London at this point and from England on Tony Blair, on many issues, on the monarchy, is there, when we were there last doing a program, we got this sense that London was almost emerging as a city-state itself, that in this new world. Is that debate subsided? Is it growing? Where is that whole question?
I think the big debate now has moved north to Scotland and to the regions of Britain. And everyone who looks at Scotland, which is going to have its first election for a parliament, a Scottish parliament next May, is looking up the recent history of Quebec. Yes. And wondering if Scotland is basically going to become the Quebec of Britain.
And what lesson would they learn, pray tell?
Oh my God.
Yes, exactly.
I think that they would learn that the Scottish nationalists will be strong there basically as a negotiating principle, and that independence will not come.
That seems to be the view here on alternate Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Exactly.
A pleasure to have you back for this discussion. Bill Emmett, the editor-in-chief of The Economist magazine, as usual, giving us the complete tour. Are you exhausted now? You've been from one end of the continent to the other. Thanks so much. Stay with us. When we come back, Paul Somerville, Jeff Rubin will take a look at the Canadian economy and the state we're in. Some interesting reports of late about the Canadian economy. 2/3 of us are quite fearful about our economic futures. The gap between the rich and the poor growing. And of course this week a report saying that Canadians' economic well-being has declined every year since 1990. So to paint the picture in this country, we're pleased to have with us Jeff Rubin. He is chief economist with CIBC Wood Gundy. And Paul Somerville, chief economist, RBC Dominion Securities, a team that we've had here many times before. So are you as dour in your predictions, Jeff, that the worst is not over, the worst is yet to come?
I think for the global economy, that's certainly true, that we're going to see a full-fledged Latin American recession well before we see any evidence of an Asian recovery. What it means for us in Canada really depends more on the impact on the United States. Yeah. We don't have direct trade exposure with Latin America. There is some bank exposure. I suspect that we're going to continue to muddle along as long as the U.S. doesn't fall into recession. We'll probably grow at a very similar rate to the U.S. economy. The difference is that there's still this huge slack in Canada that we've never made up.
But if Bill Emmett is right and the U.S. is headed toward a recession,
the U.S. is
it inevitable for us then?
If the U.S. goes into a recession, not only will Canada have a recession, but we'll have a much deeper recession.
Paul?
That's clear.
Well, we are forecasting the U.S. is going into a recession, and Canada as well. I think for quite a long time now, we've been very concerned about the risks from Japan, the risks out of Asia. We wrote a piece about a year ago called Asian Earthquake, and we're very fearful of the economic impact on North America. And we think we're going to see that quite clearly next year, beginning with the banking system and then really through consumption and investment.
So what then has to happen? I mean, Paul Martin is telling us, repeatedly that the fundamentals are in order. If we just keep our belts tight, everything will be fine. He's not going to do much spending because, the world is coming to our border.
Well, there's really two policy levers. One is interest rates, and the other is what Paul Martin does for a living. My own view is he's doing the right thing, which is to hold off on the fiscal side until you get deep cuts in interest rates. And we're forecasting big cuts by the Fed and by the Bank of Canada. There's a lot of room to cut interest rates in Canada today.
Do you agree, Jeff?
No, I actually think that Paul Martin's part of the problem, that the fiscal policy's been a huge brake on growth in Canada, that the price we've paid for government surpluses is the fact that Canadians' living standards have dropped 7 years in a row.
Yeah.
This is the most depressed those standards have been in the entire post-war period. And I think that the key reason for that are the huge increases in taxation, which have led to these government surpluses, but really robbed Canadian consumers of purchasing power.
So do you want tax cuts, even if it means they don't pay down the debt?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I don't think that we have to pay down $11 billion of debt this year, and that's where the surplus is going. I think that it's long overdue that Canadian consumers got some tax relief.
Paul, agree or no on that?
Well, we've not agreed on that. We feel that it's very important to stay the course in terms of running surpluses and doing what Martin has decided to do, which is to use any surpluses to pay down debt. Because of the risk of a riot in the long end of the bond market, people are, the reality is that Canada had 25 years of economic policy mismanagement, and the price Canada is paying is lower standards of living in the 90s.
And that's just the way it is.
And that's just the way it is.
Well, that's going to be the way it is as long as we keep on running up those huge surpluses. And I just wonder now, with the tax gap between Canada and the United States at record proportions, how much longer Canadians are going to accept that.
All right, one of the other issues I want to put on the table, and because you're both of you are talking about interest rate cuts and that, inflation is under control, so that shouldn't be a problem, but are we going too far the other way? Certainly in some of the other economies, even the Asian economies, we are talking about deflation as being part of the problem. Is that part of the problem here?
I think in the States and in Canada, it's true that firms have lost their pricing power. Doesn't necessarily mean deflation, because in Asia you have huge recessions. But I think what people are worried about is that in the particular type of recession that we're seeing in Japan, interest rate cuts really are impotent. I mean, we've got interest rates down 0.25% in Japan, and banks still aren't lending.
And it still isn't working.
Yeah, and that, I think, is the concern that Greenspan has and why he's been so aggressive to cut rates. Collateral damage on banks, some hedge funds blowing up, have the potential to create similar type conditions. And what we've seen is that once you get bank balance sheets badly damaged, that it's not so easy to get the economy going, even with interest rates that are virtually non-existent as they are in Japan.
So what are investors and consumers supposed to make of this? I mean, if you sit there and look at the stats, we all know it. Everybody doesn't believe the pension fund is going to be there for them, so everybody's got their money in RRSPs and playing with the stock market, and then something like this hits and we're going to be eating cat food in our 60s.
Well, not that. I think that the way investors have behaved to date is the reality that you keep investing, you keep saving, and you control your consumption. I mean, those are the basic parameters of ending up when you're 60 eating caviar, as opposed to cat food. The reality is too that I think there were very exaggerated expectations that people had about the returns of the stock market, and it's maybe good in a way that you've had this very sharp, kick in the head to wake people up about the reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's been since the 70s, I think, that the Standard and Poor's index has averaged like 16%.
Well, really with a vengeance since 1992. So I think that's very important, and it's a wake-up call for people to be prudent. I think Canadians generally haven't got caught up in the excess because it really, the Canadian stock markets really didn't take off until 1996. I think in the U.S., though, there's lots and lots of evidence of excess in consumption and investment. because of the stock market, and that's probably why the recession there will be quite sharp.
So, bull, bear?
Well, I think that it's going to be very hard to get the kind of returns that we've seen in the stock market the next 12, 14 months. You're just not going to have the earnings. It's going to be a big crunch on earnings. I disagree with Paul. I don't think that we're headed for a recession, but we're certainly headed for an earnings recession, and that's probably going to be sufficient to keep the stock market.
Okay, so what does
below.
that mean, an earnings recession?
It means that firms aren't going to be making money,
Right.
and if firms aren't going to be making money, stock prices probably aren't going up.
But
And
that also means layoffs. And
that's right, and more fundamentally, firms may not invest. And I would say that if there's an Achilles heel to the U.S. or Canadian economy, it's not the consumer, it's businesses. If they don't have the earnings, and all of a sudden they can't raise the kind of capital they have in the market, then we may see one of the pillars of North American domestic strength capital spending collapse next year. That's the danger.
And we think that's what's going to happen. We think that the
Oh,
stock
sure,
market...
agree on this point.
I think we agree
the
that
stock
if it does
market's
happen,
going to
it'll
be
come
weak.
through that vehicle.
We think the stock market is going to be weak, and that exactly what Jeff is saying is going to occur. Investment's going to dry up, and consumption's going to weaken. Bingo, you got a recession.
So what does the consumer do then in the short term to prepare for that in terms of their investments and their planning?
Well, I think that the consumer continues to spend because his or her fundamentals are okay right now. Down the road, if businesses stop investing, then those fundamentals for the household may not be so okay. But I think that we're going to see a much more cautious attitude toward household investment. Not that they're not going to save, but where they're going to put savings.
But that's the problem. I mean, you guys sit here and say, you know, it's going to be rough times out there, yet the economy wants us to go and spend.
That's right. That's right. And I think consumers are going to spend, notwithstanding what we're saying. I think that the key concern here is are businesses going to be able to spend? And that's really what bears watching.
Is there anything there that leads you, I mean, we've seen kind of in the U.S. side, we were talking about this with Bill, you know, the consumer demand is starting to tighten a little bit in that sense. Might we follow suit, and then are we provoking the situation even faster?
Well, I just think that the reality is that credit is more expensive, that there has been a real surge, unsustainable surge in consumption, particularly in the U.S., based on really unrealistic expectations of the stock market. The stock market goes down, consumption dries up, and again, the point on investment, companies stopping spending. And the reality is the last 5 years, you've had a real boom in investment in the United States, and that's going to turn into a bust.
A couple of things I'd like to hear you both on. Yesterday, of course, the Quebec election officially called. Have we really factored that all in? Have we all heard this song and danced so many times before that the market really won't react?
Well, you know, I don't think the Canadian dollar's woes can be blamed on Quebec, and there's a whole host of other reasons. I think the market's well conditioned to accept the fact that the Parti Québécois is probably going to win that election. I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. And I think one thing is clear, that the referendum's taken a back seat in this election. And unless that changes dramatically, I don't see this election as having a major impact. If there is a miraculous victory by the Liberals, and I think at this point that would have to be viewed as a long shot, then you might argue that to the extent there's some systemic risk premium always priced in the Canadian market because of Quebec, that will come out. But I don't see Quebec being the flashpoint or trigger point for a blow-up in the Canadian dollar. Other things may be for the Canadian dollar, but not Quebec.
A quick point on Gordon Thiessen this week and sort of wading into the banking debate and the merger debate. Were you surprised by that?
Not terribly.
So what he seems to be saying is too big might be risky.
Well, there's a lot of different views out there, Pamela.
I think this is a sensitive area, of course, but it is one of those questions, and we heard it from Bill, and we saw it at the IMF meetings, that controlling banks at some point has to be a domestic, you know, move in terms of doing our part on the international scene.
That's a different point, and I think it's very, very important to stress that countries like Canada, like the United States, like the UK, Germany, that have open and transparent banking systems based on the rule of law are going to end up and get through this mess a lot better than countries that didn't, like Russia and Indonesia and perhaps Japan. So Canada's well served by its
You got
banking
5
system.
seconds on banks.
They're important.
You guys and their banking connections, they won't say anything. Paul Somerville, Chief Economist at RBC Dominion Securities, and Jeff Rubin, Chief Economist at CIBC Wood Gundy. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you tomorrow.